Hello there. Welcome to the Credible Faith Show. Does the evidence support universal common ancestry? If that is a question that sounds interesting to you, I have a great guy to talk to with me today, and that is Casey Luskin. We will be talking about universal common ancestry today, or evidence pertaining to it. And the theory of intelligent design itself is actually amenable to either way you answer the question, yes or no. It merely states the simple assertion that the best explanation for specified information in nature is that there's a designing intelligence behind it. It makes no claim as to whether life is all descended from a single organism or not. It also makes no claim in regards to the age of the earth or the universe or other things like that. It just makes a simple assertion that the best explanation for the present effect that we see of design in nature is that they're designing intelligence. That's an abductive inference that is made and that is legitimate because there's only one known cause of the significant amount of specified complex information that we find in nature, and that is intelligence. Whenever we take the information we find in nature and trace it back to the source, we inevitably find that there's an intelligence there. And objective inferences are acceptable reasoning from present effect to past cause when there is only one known source of information or one known cause that can produce the effect in question. One other thing I would like to do before, or two other things actually. One is just a note about that issue of the age of the earth, even though the theory of intelligent design is in large part nothing to say to that, and thus can have both people in its camps, those who think in a young earth view, which is much vilified in the culture, and to which I would lean to, thinking that the best explanation of scientific and other evidence is that. Or if you're on the other side of the camp, which many people in the ID movement are, and I think Casey Luskin is himself, thinking the Earth maybe, if he may correct me if I'm wrong, the Earth may be around 4.6 billion years old, universe around 13.6 or something not too far from that, which is Casey's view, but intelligent design doesn't really care. All right, let's get over to Casey. Casey Luskin, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Good. It's great to be chat with you here, Paul.
So let's dive right in. You wrote in your paper, and this is actually coming from a chapter in a book that which you're the editor of, and the book is The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Am I correct on that?
That's right. Yeah.
When did that book come out?
It came out in October of 2021. So as of this date, it came out just a few weeks ago.
Nice. Well, congratulations on that. That's pretty. How long was it in the gestation?
The project started in 2018, but I told my co-editors that basically don't expect me to do anything on this project until after I'm done with my PhD. And so I did not really do anything as far as editing chapters or, really compiling stuff and doing work on it until after I returned to the US from South Africa last year and had submitted my PhD thesis and was sort of waiting for revisions and all that.
Okay. And congratulations on the PhD, by the way, even though it's been some time. If I understand correctly from when we talked some time ago, you have quite the story about getting back to the US and coronavirus. What happened there?
Yeah, it was a story. And I've told the story a few times, and I always say that I know everybody had a crazy 2020. So I'm not trying to glamorize my story compared to somebody else's. A lot of people had rough years last year and had rough years this year too. But I basically had to move twice during the first 4 or 5 months of the lockdown. The first move was a 10,000 miles move, moving from South Africa back to the US. My wife and I were told we had about maybe a week or so notice that we had to leave South Africa or we could be stranded there because they were closing the borders. We caught one of the last flights out of South Africa before they shut down all international air traffic, and then got back to the US in the early stages of the lockdown and got to sort of rebuild our lives, in those first few months of 2020, March, April, May, and we got to enjoy basically, trying to deal with culture shock, reverse culture shock, coming back to the US after living abroad for 4.5 years, plus the lockdown, plus not having a car or cell phone or anything. And then we had a second move later in the year. We moved back to Seattle in August of 2020, also during the lockdown. So that was a 1,200 mile move. So anyway, fun year, but we got through it.
All right. Well, if we go forward to now, the book is out. You have a chapter in there. You have, I think, 5 chapters of which you are the author or a co-author. And we're going to be looking at material from one of them. Does the evidence support universal common ancestry? If we dive into your thesis or your chapter in this book, does the evidence support universal common ancestry? There's a quote in the introduction section of your chapter, and it says, the central claim of the theory of evolution, as laid out in 1859 by Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species, is that living species, despite their diversity in form and way of life, are the products of descent with modification from common ancestors. And you go on and you look at different definitions of evolution: change over time, common ancestry, which is what we would be looking at today, and natural selection acting upon random mutations without an intelligent designer. And that natural selection acting on random mutations being the central drive of change in organisms over time. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there are three general definitions of evolution that are used in the scientific community. First of all, you can define it just as change over time, the idea that living organisms that are alive today are different than organisms that were alive in the past, the idea that there are small-scale changes within species. No one disagrees with this form of sort of small-scale microevolution, we might call it. The second definition is common ancestry, the idea that all living organisms are related. So if you go back far enough, then you share a common ancestor with your pet dog, and back a little bit further, you share a common ancestor with your pet goldfish. Go back even further, you share a common ancestor with your pet rose bush, and go back even further, and you share a common ancestor with the fungus that's growing on the bottom of your foot and the bacteria in your gut. So basically all living organisms are related. Now that, as you correctly said, and by the way, that was a great introduction you gave to sort of nuancing the conversation, what intelligent design says and doesn't say. Intelligent design is compatible with common ancestry. You could have living organisms sharing common ancestors, and yet the mechanism of that ancestry or that evolution might have been guided by an intelligent agent. And so intelligent design is not necessarily incompatible with the view that living organisms share common ancestry. And so there are some leading folks in the ID movement, like I would say Michael Behe, Michael Denton, and others who are proponents of intelligent design and proponents of common ancestry. Excuse me. So yeah, that's just important to say from the outset. Now, the third definition of evolution is that the driving mechanism of that change is random mutation operating upon natural selection. And that is where intelligent design really butts heads with evolution, in that natural selection says that sort of it's an apparently unguided process. It operates without any intelligent guidance or oversight. It just is a natural law at work. You don't need to control it. Well, intelligent design says that there are some features of nature, say the complex language-based code, the digital information in our DNA that forms the basis for encoding proteins and bonding plans in living organisms, that when you have this language-based code in life, that requires an intelligent cause for it to be able to originate. And it's not going to arise via an unguided process. Information, language-based code don't come from unintelligent mechanisms. You need an intelligent mechanism to be able to produce those things. So intelligent design butts heads with evolution when it comes to the origin of these complex features that in our experience only come from intelligence and don't come from a sort of a mindless mechanistic process.
Okay. One of the things that you point out in your article is, and I'll quote you here, you say, however, in their eagerness to take Darwin to the public, evolutionists often make a mistake, confusing common ancestry as evidence for the full-blown Darwinian story, conflating the second and third definitions of evolution. While this rhetorical strategy is logically flawed, evidence for common ancestry is not necessarily evidence for blind natural selection. If the evidence for universal common ancestry is weak, then their arguments for neo-Darwinism face not just a logical problem, but also a factual one. Can you tease that out some or put it in language perhaps that might be easier to sort of grasp onto?
Yeah, it is a little bit complicated. So the idea is that, I mean, you quoted that at the beginning of this conversation, a quote from the paper in the journal Science, which basically said that common ancestry is the core of evolutionary theory. That paper goes on to say that phylogenetic trees, the most direct representation of the principle of common ancestry, are the very core of evolutionary theory. And so this idea that organisms are related through descent with modification really is the core of of the modern view of evolution. Now, of course, we can debate over what the mechanism of that evolution was, but that is a very important part of the modern theory of evolution, even going back to Darwin's day. So when evolution apologists want the public to embrace Darwin, they often will bypass the more controversial aspects of evolutionary theory, namely that an unguided mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is generating all the complex and beautiful diversity of life. And they'll say, no, we're not going to talk about natural selection, sort of the mechanism by which all of this complexity arose. We're just going to talk about circumstantial or inferential evidence that shows that living organisms are related. And then if you can get them to that point, then the idea is the rest of the evolutionary model will flow from there. But that is, like I said, it's a logical fallacy, because evidence that organisms are related is not necessarily evidence that they are evolved through a blind and unguided evolutionary process. So, for example, there's this famous illustration from an evolutionary biologist named Tim Barra, who wrote a book where he showed how over the generations, the Corvette has evolved. Okay, so you go back in the past, and a Corvette had a certain design, and you come to the present, and Corvettes are still they're still making Corvettes. They're still a pretty cool car, but you can see how the body shape of the Corvette has evolved over time. And he said, this is how organisms evolve through descent with modification, sort of showing common ancestry. Well, there's a problem with that argument, right? That evolution, that descent with modification was all intelligently designed. None of it happened by a blind and unguided mechanistic process. So the fact that something can change or evolve over time and be modified as it descends through time, that does not necessarily tell you how it was modified, or that change was an unguided mechanistic form of change. So I think they call it Barra's blunder, is what Philip Johnson called it. It's a great example of mistaking evidence for common ancestry as evidence for unguided evolution. Those are two separate issues. Now, that being said, if it is true that living organisms are not all related through common ancestry, then we're not just dealing with a rhetorically flawed argument when you say that, oh, organisms are related, therefore the whole show is unguided. You're not just dealing with a rhetorically flawed argument, you're also dealing with a factually flawed argument, because you can no longer say that living organisms are all related through common ancestry. So it is an important topic to look at. And if it turns out that living organisms are not related, then we should want to know that. If they are related, fine, we should want to know that too. I mean, we can, my personal views on intelligent design, my personal religious convictions are not going to rise or fall on common ancestry, but it still is an important question to ask. And I think enough questions have been raised about the mechanism of evolution. And if life's history no longer appears unguided, then maybe we're also losing a rationale that's often used to say that life is related. So it's a whole mix of ideas that are tied together, and it's okay to challenge some of them.
One of the conclusions that you have a section near the end of it in which you raised the question of, is universal common ancestry testable? And the issue is that some theorists have floated the idea that universal common ancestry might not be true, but there might be multiple trees, which is a sort of tacit admission that the evidence is against universal common ancestry. And if you're already going to go and ignore the astronomical probabilities for evolution in regards to the origin of life, abiogenesis, and then the origin of animal body plans, and the origin of specific features, and the origin of orphan genes, and a whole lot of other stuff that is just so astronomically improbable as single events, but then when you compound them all together, it becomes even more astronomically improbable on top of astronomically improbable. Why don't more evolutionists just sort of give it up and say, all right, we'll go with a forest of trees rather than a single tree, if they're already willing to face the possibility of these astronomically improbable things happening, and if they're willing to invoke them in cases where the tree doesn't line up and they bring in convergent evolution or loss of function to sort of make the tree fit?
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. And look, I mean, I don't know if I can get into the psychology of why people retain a theory.
No, right.
I think that the historians of science would certainly say that reigning paradigms are very resistant to falsification, and that scientists tend to be intolerant of arguments against reigning paradigms. And so you certainly see that with the topic of universal common ancestry. I talk about this quite a bit in my chapter, that when data challenges universal common ancestry, that ought to say count against it. What evolutionary biologists will typically do is they will sort of invoke these ad hoc secondary explanations, which are designed to accommodate data which contradicts the theory of common ancestry and sort of explain it away. So they don't actually have to ever admit that the theory actually is being challenged by the data. They can say, well, in this case, it wasn't, maybe descent didn't produce this, but it wasn't like the whole show is null and guided. We can explain it through this or that, and descent so explains all these other things. So, and you correctly raised loss of traits and convergent evolution as good examples of this. So convergent evolution is the idea that two organisms will independently stumble upon the same evolutionary solution to a given problem. Okay.
Yeah.
So convergent evolution flies in the face of the methods that we typically use to infer common ancestry. Usually the way we infer common ancestry is when we find functional biological similarity that is shared between two organisms or two species. We will say that the reason they share that similar trait is because they inherited it from a common ancestor. Okay.
Yeah.
But what happens when you find similar traits that are shared by organisms that are very distantly related, and you don't even think a common ancestor had that trait? So, for example, let's consider eyes on humans and octopus, cephalopods. Okay.
Yeah.
Cephalopods have two eyes. Okay. Very much like us. But no one thinks that the common ancestor of humans and other vertebrates and cephalopods had two eyes. In fact, we don't even know if the common ancestor of humans and cephalopods, which are a kind of mollusk, we don't even know if it had eyes. Okay. Yeah. So the fact that we have two eyes and an octopus has two eyes is convergent evolution. We just by chance stumbled upon the same design. So here's an example where shared biological similarity is not the result of common ancestry. Okay. So we have to ask the question, well, does that mean that shared biological similarity is not necessarily
in other cases?
Yeah. What about the other cases? Does that mean that we can't always bank on shared biological similarity being a good indicator of common ancestry? And this becomes a real problem for evolutionary biologists when they try to reconstruct our phylogenetic trees. They have difficulty distinguishing similarity that is the result of common ancestry from similarity that might be the result of other processes like convergent evolution, like loss of traits. And there are a variety of other sort of ad hoc mechanisms that are used to explain away data that doesn't fit a tree. So Simon Conway Morris, a very famous evolutionary biologist from Oxford, he says that he likes to say in his books that convergent evolution is ubiquitous, that it's everywhere, it's rampant. And he's right. When we look at nature, we find similarities among organisms that are not very well explained by common ancestry. So we have to ask the question of whether we're going to ever let that evidence count against common descent. The average evolutionary biologist, to get back to your question, is simply not putting common descent on the table for falsification. Okay. For whatever reasons, be they sociological or maybe scientific, maybe they don't think the evidence against common descent is very strong. Or maybe they think certain lines of evidence trump others. So even if you have some evidence that challenges common descent, they think that other evidence shows it must be true. And they kind of stick to that. And so, whatever their reasons might be, or maybe they're just wedded to the idea. They really like the idea that they're related to bacteria and fungus. Maybe it plays a role in sort of, their worldview, which maybe in some cases views humanity as not very special. I don't know. I can't speak for them. I'm just speculating here. Whatever reasons they don't want to put common ancestry on the table, this is what happens. They invent these ad hoc explanations to explain away data that doesn't fit the theory. But, and this is a very big but, there are mainstream, even materialistic evolutionary scientists who still adhere to a materialistic view of the history of life. And there are folks in that coming from that perspective who are explicitly disagreeing and critiquing common ancestry now. So common ancestry is not universally supported by mainstream biologists.
Yeah. So you, in your chapter, you give a number of areas in which there's evidence against universal common ancestry. Biogeography is one. fossil record is another. Embryology would be one, at least in the sense that it's been advocated in the past as being for universal common ancestry. And when you look at it, there is no significant evidence there in favor of universal common ancestry. And you were touching on here another area, I think you might have 4 areas, and that is DNA and anatomy-based phylogenetic trees. And you say in your article, you asked the question, but does a tree of life exist? In the 1990s, biologists made a startling discovery. Life falls into 3 basic domains, which cannot be resolved into a tree-like pattern. So can you tell me what would be those 3 domains? Because this appears to be something at least somewhat different than you're raising the question of cephalopods and humans with their 2 eyes.
Yeah, the domains are bacteria, eukarya, and archaea. Basically, this was discovered when they started to sequence organisms in the mid 1990s. And at that time, they actually really discovered that, they had the 5 or whatever kingdoms of life. They discovered that the kingdoms were not a sufficient way to describe the highest level taxonomic categories of life. And instead, life really broke down into 3 different domains. And bacteria and archaea are all single-celled organisms. And then eukarya includes some single-celled organisms, but then of course others like us and animals and metazoans that are multicellular. So yeah, that's basically the idea. And when you try to resolve these basic domains into a tree of life, it really cannot be done.
Okay, there's 2 areas in which you can look at evidence for the construction of phylogenetic trees. One has to do with anatomy, the other has to do with genes. And when you look at both of those areas, if I read your chapter correctly, you have multiple cases in which conflicting phylogenetic trees are produced. And not only that, do they conflict within each other, such as a tree constructed from 1 or more genes conflicts with a tree constructed with 1 or more other genes. And not only is it the case that a phylogenetic tree based on one certain trait, and you mentioned the example of the column, you can have a phylogenetic tree based on one aspect of anatomy conflicting with a different one, but you can have conflicts between the 2 sides. You can have conflicts between a phylogenetic tree based on DNA with a phylogenetic tree based on anatomy. Now, I haven't studied too much of that area, so if you can enlighten us some in regards to details about those conflicts, that would be great.
Sure. So there are different ways of constructing phylogenetic trees. Some phylogenetic trees are used constructing body parts or anatomy or morphology. Other phylogenetic trees are constructed using DNA evidence, basically sequencing genes and comparing the similarities and differences between genes, different organisms. And in all cases, the basic idea is that organisms that are more similar anatomically or genetically tend to be more closely related in a tree. And those that are less similar tend to be more distantly related. Okay. So that's the basic way that these trees are constructed. The problem is that sometimes you get very different results depending on which traits you use, whether we're talking about anatomy-based traits or gene-based traits. You can get very different results for what trees are created, and those trees often conflict with each other. In fact, there's a paper that was published in the journal Biological Reviews in 2012 that said that phylogenetic conflict is common and frequently the norm rather than the exception. Or another paper in Trends in Genetics said, the more we learn about the genomes, the less tree-like we find their evolutionary history. Or a study in the journal Genome Research said, different proteins generate different phylogenetic trees. So the problem is you take one gene or one trait, you get one version of the tree of life. You take another trait, you get another version or gene, you get another version of the tree of life. And what's basically going on here is organisms or traits among organisms are not distributed in a tree-like manner, okay? If they were, then everything should be giving you basically the same tree-like pattern. But you get one gene gives you one tree, and it says that you should be this degree of similarity to this organism. But then you look at another gene and you find that actually that gene is more similar to your organism than it should be according to the tree that you first made. Okay, so that gene does not fit this tree. Same goes for using anatomical traits to construct trees. So let me just basically read you a little passage from the book that I think will explain this, what phylogenetic conflict is. So conflicts exist between trees based upon molecules versus those based upon body structure, called morphology. A review in Nature titled Bones, Molecules, or Both explained that, quote, evolutionary trees constructed by studying biological molecules often don't resemble those drawn up for morphology. And it admitted that, quote, battles between molecules and morphology are being fought across the tree of life. And then I said, a classic example involves attempts to construct a phylogenetic tree of the animal phyla. Traditionally, many of the phyla were grouped according to whether they had a central body cavity called a coelom. But molecular data contradicted that grouping and instead placed organisms that are morphologically distinct, such as nematodes and arthropods, very close, a result that nature called surprising. Higher up the tree, conflicts persist. In 2014, sequencing of various bird genomes showed that birds that were previously thought to be very closely related, water birds, birds of prey, and songbirds, evolved their groups, defining traits convergently. As nature put it, the tree of life for birds has been redrawn. So you get these traits that, shouldn't be similar among two organisms. All right. And so this is where you get these conflicts between trees. Depending on what trait you use, you get one tree or another tree. It shows that there's similarities that are appearing in organisms that cannot be explained by a pattern of common descent.
You make a point that just because someone presents a neat and tidy phylogenetic tree doesn't mean that the underlying data set is actually tree-like. So the tree's presented, but to get that tree, one, it may not exactly line up with the data, but two, you can take the data and invoke convergent evolution or loss of traits to try and weed off the parts that don't exactly fit well with the tree. So if I'm thinking of a student, a nephew, or someone else who's going in high school and he sees a nice thing in a textbook, what would you say to a kid like that if he was presented with a journal article that says this is actually only 65% or 40% congruent with the actual data that's supposedly underlying it? And if I do read the data and if it says 40% congruent or not, what does that mean? And then after that, I'll let you answer, but after that, I want to go on to Winston Ewert's dependency graph model and the idea of a designer reusing components, which is actually far more amenable to explaining these pieces of data that sometimes line up with the tree and sometimes don't, and that thus seem a better explanation of the data than the theory that all of life is tree-like.
Sure. So if I was talking to your nephew, the first thing I would tell him is that it's important to understand that every phylogenetic tree is built entirely upon assumptions. Okay. The raw data are, we just have organisms with different traits. Okay. This bird has wings, blue feathers, and a beak. This mammal has sharp teeth, hair, and 4 legs. Okay. We look at different traits in organisms, we compare them, we ask, and then we assume when we build a phylogenetic tree that similar traits.
And hold on. Let me stop you there. You say assume. So if he asks, okay, but the teacher says that's the assumption to make, would you say to him, well, actually, there's no basis for the assumption. It's just what we do to get along in the scientific community, or what?
I wouldn't say there's no basis for the assumption that similarity reflects inheritance from a common ancestor. What I would say is that there's no basis to assume that the assumption is always true. And there's no basis for saying that assumption has to hold true in all cases or even in many cases. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, we know of other mechanisms that can generate similarities between different organisms. One of those, or different designs, let's call it common design. Designers will regularly reuse parts that work in different designs. Well, I know we'll get to the Winston Ewert graph model.
You can get to it now if you want.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll just say designers will, it's a good design principle if you're an engineer or a technology designer, to reuse parts that have a particular function that you need in different designs. Okay. So for example, engineers will put wheels on both cars and airplanes. They'll put keyboards on both laptops and cell phones. They'll put lights on both, the front end of a car and also in your living room. So we can reuse parts that perform a useful function in many different designs. So the fact that we see similarities appearing between different organisms does not necessarily can be explained by common descent. It can also be explained by common design. That's point one. Let's forget about common design for a second. Okay, let's just take that out of the equation. We know, based upon conflicts between phylogenetic trees, that it's very frequently the case that similarities between organisms cannot be explained by common ancestry. Okay, and this is where we were talking about convergent evolution earlier. When we get similarities which are not thought to have even been present in a common ancestor. Okay, so the fact that we have two eyes, or that a squid or an octopus has two eyes, that's convergent evolution. But actually, the similarities between a human eye and an octopus eye go much deeper than the mere fact that we have two eyes. Both organisms have what we would call a type of camera eye, which has a very similar basic design, which is nearly identical in almost all respects. Okay, there's some differences, but the basic design of our eyes and a squid or octopus eye is nearly identical. Okay, and yet those similarities are said to have arisen strictly by chance. Okay, there's no inheritance from a common ancestor that caused a squid to have a camera eye and us to have a camera eye. It's simply by chance that we have this nearly identical eye design. So that is an example of similarity that cannot be explained by inheritance from a common ancestor. Okay, so of course, an evolutionary biologist will invoke convergent evolution, but every time you invoke convergent evolution, this is now an example of where your main assumption of tree building has failed. Your assumption that similarity reflects inheritance from a common ancestor. And so when you look at the literature and you look at some of these phylogenetic trees that are published, you find that sometimes upwards of 30, 40, even more than 50% of the characters that they're studying in a data set do not fit into a tree-like pattern when you try to take all those organisms with their characters and fit them into a tree. The evolutionary biologists have to always explain or use some sort of secondary after-the-fact explanation to explain why the data isn't in a tree, convergence, loss, etc.
Yeah, so if I can stop you right there. So suppose we just have 10 traits and you're going to build a tree and your animals all fit into this tree, but only 5 of those traits are such that they trace back to a single individual that had them, that then gave them to its descendants. And then the other ones are cases where the trait is in one part of the tree, and if you trace it back, the earliest ancestor of it that had it is not also an ancestor of the other one. So you have 2 parts of the tree in which you have 2 ancestors that developed this trait, and they don't go back to an ancestor that also had the trait. They just sort of came up with it on their own. Those separately developed, evolved, quote unquote, traits are not evidence for universal common descent because they appear in 2 different parts of the tree. And yet, evolutionists would want to come along and say, common features demonstrate that the tree is correct, that there was a tree in regards to the descent of life from earlier organisms. Depending on where you look in the tree, it's evidence for common ancestry, and it's not evidence for common ancestry. Cherry picking, if I may call it that.
I think what you said is mostly accurate. Yes, there certainly is an element of cherry picking. In fact, sometimes there are recommendations that biologists should just ignore what they call unreliable data. There's a molecular systematics textbook that says eliminate unreliable data. Basically, data that doesn't fit the tree very well. We can just assume that something wonky happened there, and that's why the data is doing something different from the rest of the tree is saying. So yeah, I mean that is certainly a practice that they engage in. But yeah, I mean the problem is that that the idea that similarity implies inheritance from a common ancestor, that's an assumption. And it's an assumption that fails over and over again when we're trying to construct phylogenetic trees. So that does not make for a very compelling model.
Yeah. So that is the one area in regards to evidence that is supposedly supporting universal common ancestry, DNA, and anatomy-based phylogenetic trees. Let's go on to a different area, and that has to do with biogeography. And if I can quote you, you say, much biogeographical data, however, has little to do with Darwinian evolution and does not provide special evidence for common ancestry. It can be easily explained as the result of migration and continental drift, 2 conventional ideas accepted by virtually everyone in this debate. And that's sort of responding to the idea that biogeography supports it. But I think for people who are listening, that may even be already diving into the weeds. And if you could sort of take us back out to the airplane level, give a sort of overview of what the argument would be for supposedly universal common ancestry from biogeography, and then take us down lower into some of the details about why there's evidence against universal common ancestry from biogeographical data.
Sure. So what is biogeography? Biogeography is the study of the distribution of organisms in both time and space across the surface of the Earth over Earth's history. Okay. So evolutionary scientists will say that the way that we find organisms, the places that we find them over time, are consistent with their having evolved from common ancestors. Okay. So they'll say that there's a congruity between biogeographic patterns, sort of where organisms have lived in the past on Earth, and evolutionary patterns. And this continuity, they say, is or this congruency is what you would expect if common descent were true. So the problem is that, again, you're dealing with a cherry picking of data. All right. A lot of the data that's biogeographical in nature and is said to support evolution really can be explained very easily by basic concepts like migration, plate tectonics. It doesn't provide any kind of special evidence for common ancestry. There are some examples, though, where it's very difficult to explain how organisms got to where they are today on Earth via some unbroken chain of ancestry going back to their parent group or their ancestral group. Okay. So a good example of this, or I think one of the most compelling examples of this, is the origin of South American monkeys. Those are called platyrrhines, and they're thought to be descended from old world monkeys from Africa, which are called catarrhines. So the fossil record shows that monkeys have lived in South America for about 30 million years. So fine. The idea is that somehow African monkeys made their way to South America and migrated there and colonized South America, which led to monkeys proliferating on South America. But they're originally coming from Africa. Okay. So the problem with this story is that plate tectonics has now shown us that South America was an isolated island continent from about 80 million years ago to 3.5 million years ago. And because it was an isolated island continent that was separated from other continents by, say, up to hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of open ocean, how then do you get the African monkeys to get to South America to populate it? Okay. It's a real biogeographical conundrum. If South American monkeys are in fact descended from African monkeys, then you have to explain how that evolutionary migration occurred. And it's very difficult to do that. One of the ways that it's done is through what they call rafting hypothesis. They will actually propose that not just one, but at least two monkeys, or maybe I suppose one pregnant monkey, rafted across, thousands of kilometers of open ocean from all the way from Africa to South America around 30 million years ago, which is when we see our first monkey fossils in South America, or the genetic clock tells us that they diverged. So somewhere around that time, there was like a giant storm. Some monkey got caught up in the vegetation, and it sailed all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and then colonized the South American continent. Okay. Now, is it absolutely impossible? I wouldn't say it's absolutely impossible, but it's pretty improbable. Okay. In fact, monkeys tend to have very high metabolisms, which means they need a lot of food and water in order to drink. And it's hard to imagine how they could find enough of that to survive this probably many-week voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, this is so unlikely that some evolutionary biologists have called the rafting hypothesis a sweepstake hypothesis. Okay, where basically it's like winning the lottery when you're able to make this journey across the ocean. So to me, that when you're comparing something to winning the lottery, that is not a very compelling argument. It's showing that a very good stroke of luck is required in order for it to happen. And there's many examples of this from biogeography. We have trying to explain how other species got to South America, like certain large rodents or bees or lemurs, how you're getting organisms in Madagascar, how you're getting elephant fossils on various islands, the existence of various freshwater frogs in certain oceanic island chains. There's lots of examples of difficulties explaining how organisms got to where they did using biogeography, and it's a real problem for Darwinian theory, I would say, in common ancestry.
Okay, so you have to believe in the lottery to get past this hurdle, basically, if I understand what you're saying.
You got to believe in a lot of luck.
All right. So that's biogeography. Another area you talk about has to do with fossil record. You quote Donald Prothero, who says that fossils are the only direct record of the history of life, and who apparently has a very derogatory comment about people who do not believe, was it universal common ancestry? Did he compare people who don't believe it to like Nazis or something along those lines?
Yeah, he basically said that if you are doubting that there are transitional forms in the fossil record and the fossil record does not document evolution, he says, then you are a creationist who shares, quote, much in common with neo-Nazi Jew-hating Holocaust deniers, which as someone who's of Jewish descent, and I probably had relatives who tragically were killed in the Holocaust, I find this incredibly offensive. I mean, I was actually friends with a Schindler Jew growing up who spent a lot of time in my neighborhood and was friends with my family. And so, I mean, absolutely, we have eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. And so to compare, being a skeptic of Darwinian theory from the fossil record to being a Holocaust denier, I find that to be really inappropriate and just totally not good form.
So you make the remark that if universal common ancestry is true, you ought to find evidence of it in the fossil record in regards to transitional fossils. Your point would be that you don't find those transitional fossils or smooth gradation. And what you instead find is a number of explosions, Cambrian explosion, the Great Ordovician biodiversification event. You can also talk about fish groups, land animals, and others. Before talking about these different aspects of it, I would like you to touch on the question of transitional fossils. In the past, I think this would have been decades and decades and decades ago, some people thought that it may have been a sampling artifact, that there just wasn't enough fossils that had been found. And if we did more searching, those types of transitionals will be found. But if you can touch on that first and then actually go and look at the different, from a young Earth creationist perspective, supposed explosions, but from a standard view, the different explosions of life in the fossil record, Cambrian explosion and others, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the history of life shows a pattern of explosions where organisms appear abruptly without clear and direct evolutionary precursors. Now, of course, as you mentioned, Paul, the most well-known example is the Cambrian explosion, where most of the major animal phyla appear about in the Cambrian period in a sort of a geological eye blink without any clear animals that could have served as evolutionary precursors. So that's a real problem for common ancestry, because you have all these different types of organisms appearing in the fossil record around the same time, geologically speaking, without any clear evidence of their sharing a common ancestor and developing from direct evolutionary precursors. It's a major problem for common ancestry, but that's not the only explosion. There's also, as you said, a great Ordovician biodiversification event.
Hold on. I want to pause on that one right there. I would like you to elaborate on what actually the Great Ordovician biodiversification event is for people who have no idea what it is.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a rapid appearance of many invertebrate organisms in the fossil record, marine invertebrates, basically. Some of it would be planktonic type organisms, some of it would be shelled organisms, but basically the abrupt appearance of an explosive appearance of many new types of marine invertebrates over a, say, according to the standard view, would be about a 40 million year period. So that's kind of the idea. There, if you go later in the fossil record, there is a bird explosion. There's an angiosperm or flowering plant explosion. There is a tetrapod explosion. There have been trouble tracing dinosaurs due to the lack of transitional forms. There is a Did I mention the bird explosion? I think I did.
Yeah, you did.
There's also a mammal explosion. And then even the origin of our own genus Homo has been called a Big Bang model of the genus Homo, of the origin of Homo, because of the abrupt appearance of our own genus. So yeah, there's a lot of different evidence that supports this pattern of explosions. I'm probably missing a few. If you read Gunter Beckley and Stephen Meyer's chapter in the book Theistic Evolution, that's one of the most, I would say, comprehensive treatments of all the different explosions that have happened in the history of life.
Okay. All right. So those explosions are cases in which you have one layer of the fossil record showing a bunch of different organisms appearing. And if you look lower beneath that layer, you don't find a common ancestor to those organisms. And also at the same time, find the transitional forms between that common ancestor and those organisms appearing. Is that correct? Or do I need clarification there?
I think that's basically right. You could call it a layer, but you have, obviously you have structure to the geological record, and you find that there are no direct evolutionary precursors lower in the geological record. So these organisms sort of come into existence rapidly and abruptly without evidence of how they evolved. And I mean, I want to make it clear that this pattern of explosions and a lack of transitional forms is very well attested to by leading evolutionary scientists. It's not like it's just ID people that are saying this. It's pretty well accepted today that the pattern of transitional forms that was predicted by Darwin's theory did not materialize, and that we get this abrupt appearance of different taxa, over and over and over again. For example, Jeffrey Schwartz, a biologist at the University of Pittsburgh, he says, we are still in the dark about the origin of most major groups of organisms. They appear in the fossil record as Athena did from the head of Zeus, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution as resulting from the gradual accumulation of countless infinitesimally minute variations. So that's a great example of what I'm talking about here. You get these organisms that appear like they're fully formed, they're ready to just be themselves. They're not evolving piecemeal, one step at a time. And a lot of people recognize this poses a challenge to Darwin's theory.
Okay. All right. So we have 3 down that you cover in your chapter, and that's biogeography, that's the phylogenetic trees based on DNA, and morphology. And the other one, if I am not thinking of it right now, would be fossils. And then the last one has to do with embryology. And I think it may have been that when I was in biology class, a textbook had the phrase about ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny. I don't want to spend very much time on this, but if there are people who come across it, it may be worth you saying something about it. Yeah,
definitely. So, and people do sometimes still believe ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In fact, recently I was on a pretty big radio show, and one of the callers said, "Oh, well, you're wrong. Haven't you heard that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny?" I said, "Well, actually, respectfully, scientists don't believe in that anymore because they know that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. So what the heck are we talking about? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny means basically in this context, development. So the growth and development of an organism from, say, a single-celled stage up through an adult stage, that's ontogeny. Recapitulates means replays, and phylogeny means evolutionary history. So the idea is that as you are growing and developing, you are literally replaying your evolutionary history. So at one time when you were growing up, you might have gone through a fish stage, or you went through a reptile stage. That's sort of the idea, that organisms go through different stages that replay their evolutionary history.
The idea is humans evolved from single-celled organisms, then there was fish, then there was reptiles, and the humans came through that chain of single cell to fish to reptile to humans. And that when in the conception process, for example, of a human, the human is going to start off as a single cell, and then at some point he'll be in a fishy stage of development, then a reptilian stage of development, and then when he comes out the womb, he's finally reached his human stage of development. Is that basically the idea?
It kind of is. I mean, they will nuance it and say that actually that your embryo resembled a fish embryo, okay? Or your embryo resembled a reptile embryo. But it's no longer believed. I mean, it's been known for many decades that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is basically false. So even though you do still meet people that are taught this idea or that still cling to it because they were taught that it's true, It's simply not true. So we don't have to even mainstream biology has rejected this idea.
There's something called the pharyngular or phylotypic stage, given that it has been argued by some in the evolutionary camp as giving some credence to the evolutionary universal common ancestor perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that stage of the phylotypic or the pharyngular? If you can say something about that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So what's often told in textbooks is that vertebrate embryos are very similar in their earliest stages. And those similarities demonstrate or document their common ancestry. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually typically an overstatement. And in fact, what's often used to illustrate this historically have been these famous embryo drawings by the German embryologist Ernst Haeckel, which is well known were fraudulent and fake. And these drawings overstated the degree of similarity between vertebrate embryos. Okay. So vertebrate embryos, actually, when you look at the technical literature, you can find statements that show that they have wide variation in many varieties of different traits. And that it's not the case that all vertebrates start off looking the same and going through sort of this stage called the pharyngular stage, which makes them clearly related. Okay. So the idea is that organisms with the pharyngular stage, that organisms start off development very differently. Then they come together during the middle of development and they start to appear similar to one another. And then over time, they then diverge, they become their adult form. Okay. So there've also been questions that have been raised about the pharyngular stage and whether it actually exists. There was an embryologist named Michael Richardson who did a study looking at photographs of embryos, not these drawings, which can be faked. And he found that there are there's a great divergence between what the data says and what the theory predicts ought to be there in terms of similarities between organisms in these midpoint stages. And so they found in this study by Richardson, they call it the evolutionary hourglass model, the idea that organisms start development differently, become similar in this middle stage where they're supposed to be showing their common ancestry, and then they diverge again. He said that the evidence is, quote, contrary to the evolutionary hourglass model because vertebrate embryos show, quote, considerable variability during the, quote, purported phylotypic stage. That's another name for this pharyngular stage. And he said, in their view, wide variation in morphology among vertebrate embryos is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a phylogenetically conserved tailbud stage. That's another name again for the pharyngular stage. And so you can find in the literature many papers that have found that vertebrate embryos start out development very differently. They're widely divergent, and they do not show this pattern of similarities that would be expected if we all shared a common ancestor.
Okay. Well, thank you, Casey. I think that gets us to basically the end of all four of the areas, the principal areas that you touched on in regards to the question, does the evidence support universal common ancestry? The last thing I would like to do is to do a sort of elevator pitch. You start off the chapter, you look at different definitions of evolution that change over time, the universal common ancestry as the second, and then natural selection acting on random mutations that are in an unguided manner as the driver of the change for organisms as a third. And then you go into the four areas: biogeography, fossils, DNA, and anatomy-based phylogenetic trees and embryology. So that's sort of like if you were to do an outline of it. If you were to enter the elevator with someone and you have 2 minutes, what would you say to the person if they asked you, oh, you wrote a chapter in a book? What is it? Does the evidence support universal common ancestry? Tell me about it.
Well, I don't usually talk to people in elevators, so I don't know what I would say in an elevator. But, I guess if I was on like forced to have a conversation with somebody, then I would say that, look, evolutionary biologists will often say that there are multiple lines of independent evidence that provide sort of this cumulative case for common ancestry. But when you actually look at these different lines of evidence, whether it's biogeography, fossils, DNA and anatomical phylogenetic trees, and embryology, the evidence actually contradicts the predictions of common ancestry. So in biogeography, we see species having to raft across vast oceans in order to preserve common descent. In paleontology, we see this pattern of abrupt appearance and explosions in the fossil record rather than the sort of gradual change that was predicted by Darwin's idea of descent with modification. With molecular and morphological phylogenetic trees, we see that we have trees will commonly conflict with one another, which reflects the fact that a lot of the data simply is not distributed in a tree-like pattern. You cannot fit the data into a tree. And the assumption that similarity reflects common ancestry fails constantly when you're constructing these phylogenetic trees. And then with embryology, I would say that, well, it's been predicted that organisms started off development very similarly, but actually when you look at vertebrate embryos, there are wide differences in the early stages of vertebrate embryos. And the response from some evolutionary scientists here has been quite amusing because they said, well, fine, maybe evolutionary biology predicts similarities between vertebrate embryos, but I think it also predicts, they would say it also predicts differences. So it's okay that there are these differences. It doesn't just predict similarities, it also predicts differences. And then the response from a Darwin skeptic or a common descent skeptic would be, okay, fine. So you're saying that your theory predicts both similarities and differences. What does your theory actually predict? Does your theory make any useful, testable predictions? Or is it was that old adage that you may have heard before that the theory that explains everything actually explains nothing?
That reminds me of The Incredibles, where Dash hears something from his mom who says, everyone's super, or something like that. And his response is to say, which means no one's super.
Exactly. I mean, basically, every piece of data in common ancestry gets a participation trophy because everything is super. Okay, everything points for common ancestry, whether it does or not. And so at the end of the day, you have to ask the question, really, what does this theory predict? So what I would say is what's really going on here is that common ancestry was a robust theory. Okay, it's been contradicted by a lot of data. Okay. And as a result of those contradictions, biologists were given a choice. They could either reject common ancestry or they could change the theory, change its predictions, and sort of turn it into an unfalsifiable, untestable theory, which could not be falsified by the data. Okay. They chose the option B, basically. They chose the second option. Rather than acknowledging that their theory is challenged by a lot of data, they've decided to treat common ancestry in sort of an unfalsifiable manner, where no matter what the evidence is, they cannot refute it. And this basically, unfortunately, allows us to no longer treat common ancestry like a scientific theory. But if we do treat it like a science, we ask, well, what does the evidence on its face say? What does common ancestry predict? A lot of data contradicts the theory.
Okay. I think in Incredibles, it might actually be special. So if all the evidence is special for supporting universal common descent, then none of it's actually special. And I would like to actually touch to extend what you just said. If it is unfalsifiable and that evidence on one side supports it and then evidence on the other side supports it, so that whatever evidence you pick, everything supports it, which means nothing actually supports it, does it then become rather dogma or religion? Basically the secular man's religion.
Well, I mean, some people have compared evolutionary biology to a religion. I mean, I think you can test evolutionary claims. I don't like to, I don't like to say that it's inherently untestable. I don't think common descent is inherently untestable. I think it is testable. I just think that when it's been tested, we found it to be false. But I do think that some folks do treat it, sort of like an ideology that they have to protect. I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it's a religion, although, I mean, Mary Midgley, Michael Ruse, some leading philosophers of science have compared modern evolutionary biology to like a secular creation myth or a religion. I don't necessarily want to go there. I'm just going to say that I think that they are not treating it in a falsifiable manner. To say it's a religion requires a lot of other components of religion, devotion, worship. I don't know if that's necessarily what's going on with evolutionary biology, but I think my personal view, though, is that you can treat evolution as a science. You can ask if it's been falsified. You can falsify it. I think it has been falsified effectively. Some folks disagree. That's fine. They have every right to disagree. But I think that a lot of times like you said earlier, Paul, they're cherry picking data to find the data that fits the theory rather than letting the data speak for itself.
All right. Well, thank you, Casey. It's been great to have you on. I appreciate you giving so much of your time and your expertise on this topic. That is Casey Luskin, and we were talking about material from his chapter, Does the Evidence Support Universal Common Ancestry, from the book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, of which he is a co-editor. Go out and get it if you haven't, or go get other material from the Discovery Institute, assuming that is published by the Discovery. No, it's Harvest House. Never mind.
Your language. Thank you for listening and have a great night.